I'm Roger Welsh. I'm not quite sure how to identify myself other than that, but I've been involved with the Omaha tribe since I was a young man in graduate school at the university. One of the dreams of my life was to be elected to the Historical Society board. I was, and that's where I first ran into the repatriation issue when the Pawnee and the Nebraska tribes came petitioning the board for the return of burial goods and remains. And so that's where I first came in. Came in at the beginning, curiously, missed most of the middle, which these guys know about, and then came in again at the end when, again, I found use in the Pawnee Nation.
What year were you appointed to the board of the Historical Society?
Don't ever ask me numbers. I don't know numbers. Don't ask me my phone number. But I would guess it was about 88. I was elected to the board. It was an election. And I'm sure that was about the date because I moved out of Lincoln and out to the western middle part of the state in 87, and that's the area I ran from. At that time it was in district, so I don't know if it's still that way or not. But then I was elected as a representative from the central part of the state.
And you became involved with the repatriation issue because of the Pawnee letter to Hansen asking about the human remains here that could be culturally affiliated with the Pawnees? The
first exposure I had was them showing up at a meeting, and at the very end of the agenda, after everything else had been done, with the native representatives sitting along the wall waiting patiently, was to take up this issue because there was no time left. And that was the first time we heard the request, which I think pretty unanimously everybody thought was not something I was in the anthropology department at the University of Nebraska at the time, which is primarily archaeologically oriented, and it just didn't seem like anything conceivable to me at that point. And very quickly, however, became apparent to me that the contempt that the Historical Society board and director showed toward the guests at that meeting, and Louis may have even been there at that time, was the same kind of contempt that they were showing toward the remains. And that's what threw me over. And I resigned from the board in high dudgeon, very, very ugly, and joined forces with the Pawnee and the other Nebraska tribes who were seeking repatriation.
Okay. And could you identify yourself?
My name is Louis LaRose from the Winnebago tribe.
Okay. And how did you become involved with the Pawnee controversy with the Nebraska State Historical Society?
I don't know why, because I was just at a meeting when they talked about enacting a law supporting the Pawnees on reburial, and I thought it was so far out. I told Weber Whiteshirt, that's going to be the toughest battle you ever got into in your life. And I knew personally that when you come up against these kinds of battles, you got to fight them, or you'll ever remember in your life you had a chance to fight and you didn't do it. And I didn't want to be in that category. So I felt that I had to, because of the impact it would have on the Indian people and their ancestors all over the country. So it was something that came to me that I knew I had to fight.
Who is Reva Whiteshirt, and why is she important to this whole issue?
She was a former director of Indian Affairs for the state of Nebraska.
Okay. And could you identify yourself and tell us how you became involved in this issue?
Yeah. I'm Chuck Trimble, and I'm a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe of Pine Ridge Reservation. I came into the issue quite late, really, at the kind of the tail end of the horrible times that Roger was telling about. And on the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, I was serving there, and Frank Lemire asked me if he could get Governor Ben Nelson, to appoint me, would I serve on the Historical Society board? And I told him I would, although I was, quite hesitant about it, knowing what was going on, the tenseness and everything. But I did want to go. I did want to serve. And prior to that, though, I was on NETV, Nebraska Public Television, and I was asked to represent the Indian Commission, and they were talking about this whole issue of repatriation. And on the other side was Peter Bleed, Dr. Peter Bleed, who was I don't know, what is he?
He's an archaeologist.
And so we kind of went at it on TV, and but I think I made the point, just sticking to the thing that it's an issue of respect for religion, respect for the beliefs of a people, and I wasn't going to take up the point of the scientific side of it, the importance of science, or burning books, as you put it very well. And then I think that's maybe what caused Frank to see if I would serve on the Historical Society board. Frank Lemire has been involved quite deeply with the Democratic Party for quite some time, and so I think that he, was very familiar with Ben Nelson, and Ben knew him, and so he did appoint me. And I remember the tension was still so high that at the first meeting, board meeting that I would attend, Frank offered to have some warriors sitting aside in case I needed them if I was given a bad time, but I didn't think I needed it, and things went all right. But that was still the time when they were talking about the repatriation of patrimony of, in this case, I think there were a couple of presidential peace medals involved, and should those things go back, and all of that. And also in the Historical Society, it was still the time that people were suggesting that if you start giving back to Indians these things, pretty soon the tribes are going to have semi-trailers backed up to the museums, to raid the place of all the valuable Indian artifacts that they had. And of course, we've seen since the 27 years did we that hasn't happened, but that was the kind of thing. And I heard later on from board members and from other people that the Historical Society staff were making rounds over at the unicameral, essentially lobbying, against that legislation. And part of it, though, was to demean the culture, to tell horrible stories, the Morning Star ceremony, and stuff like that, to demean and make it look like, you're dealing with a bunch of savages, that whole thing. And so that was the time. The best part that I remember from that, though, was dealing with the delegation from Pawnee. And the Nebraska State Historical Society had the past Chief Justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court on the board, and he took the role of negotiating with the Pawnees. and treated him with great respect, deference, and he was, his parents were Jews from Russia, and but he handled things so well, and he told me later that of all the work that he had done in his legal career, that was one of the highlights, just dealing with such honorable people on such a honorable issue. That's what I recall.
Okay. Louis, what is your recollection of the role of the Native American Rights Fund and its attorneys in this whole issue?
They had one attorney that helped us was Bob Paraguay, and Walter and Steve were working in Kansas. And we had James Bosford was the second attorney, and I was the brown guy, because we talked about Indian human remains, and there was no question that I was Indian. With a sense of humor, I figured out the best way to hit them is to hit them right between the eyes with a one-liner, so they knew that I knew what I was talking about. We also figured out, one of the senators told us, that when you're talking about the legislation to an attorney senator, have the attorneys talk to him, because they don't like to hear from a layman. When you talk to a senator that's not an attorney, have the brown guy talk to him. So that's where I fit in.
And did you work closely with the NARF attorneys through this whole ordeal?
Like brothers.
What do you mean? Could you elaborate on that?
Like brothers. We'd have our fights. I wouldn't get into their last worst case scenario arguments. I'd let them duke it out. But we all worked together as a team. And NARF was the driving force, the glue that kept us all together, because they presented the vision, and we just followed that vision plan.
Roger, was there any discussion while you were on the board about how to head off this effort of the Pawnees to reclaim ancestral Pawnee remains?
The general thought was that it would kill itself, that the idea was so absurd. The word inane sticks in my mind because it was said at a point where it was like a nail being driven into my forehead. But the thought was that being the simple and barbaric people they are, they'd forget it sooner or later anyway. Once they were faced by this board of immensely important and wealthy people, which is what the Historical Society Board was at that time. And they thought that the appeal needed to be made to the public about this more than even confronting the tribes. So, for example, at one of the meetings, one of the presentations was that there would be no way of returning burial goods because burial goods were essentially everyday household goods. So a display was set up of this pot is a burial good, this pot is not, and they're identical. So I brought up the question at that point, well, if they're identical, what's the problem with returning the funereal goods? And it was just dead silence because there was no answer to that. What gradually happened, at least to me, I think I was the only member of the board who resigned. I may be the only member of the board who's ever resigned. Was that while I really didn't care that much about remains, I almost hate to admit that at this point, but I don't care what happens to my remains, and at that point I really didn't care what happened to these other remains. But what happened was that I cared about the people who did care about those remains. And some things, I just got goosebumps. There was a meeting in the Capitol building where the confrontation was probably at its worst, where things really broke up. And I went into the rotunda of that magnificent building, and there was my brother, Alfred Gilpin Jr., Buddy Gilpin, sitting on one of those benches crying. And he had taken quite a series of blows at that meeting. So I sat down beside him and talked with him about what was going on and wondered what was he crying about? What had hurt him most? That he had, as tribal council chairman, he was being insulted. Was it that his people were being insulted? Was it the violation of the dignity of the remains that had upset him? Or why? What had brought him to this point of sitting there alone crying? And he said what he cared about was the people at the Historical Society. That because of their attitude, their karma, for lack of, I guess, another word, I don't know the Pawnee word for it, but I'll bet there is, that they were doing such damage to themselves in the long run, to their people, to their ancestors, to themselves, that he felt bad about them. And boy, that hit me hard. Really hit me hard. And as I saw that they were, I think I mentioned, they were planning meetings with the Pawnee would come up and everybody was gone. They'd go. Well, then they started doing it to me. They would they'd call me up and say, what days are you available in December? And I'd say, and damned if the meeting wasn't another day in December when I couldn't be there. And I realized I'm getting the same kind of treatment as they are, so by God, that's the side I ought to be on. And I looked at the people on this side of the table, and I looked at the people on this side of the table, and this was the side I wanted to be with. And so it hurt. There were editorials in the papers. I was insulted in cartoons in the paper. There were letters. I was in the anthropology department with Peter Bleed. It was not comfortable for me at all. But as Louis says best of so well, my brother Louis, he said, when the battle comes like that, it's time to stand up. No matter what happens, it's time to stand up and do the battle. And boy, it was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life that I did, because I got to know people like Louis. I was invited to be a pallbearer at the first two reburials in Genoa. After the first reburial, I got a call from a lady in Pawnee who was, I guess, I think she was like the tribal council secretary or something. She wondered if they had been treated fairly in the reburial, that it was awfully expensive. Well, my buddy Mick, who's with me again today, he's a construction guy, bricklayer, built our house for us. So I called him up. He said, well, he didn't know exactly, but he checked with somebody else. So we all got together and talked about what it had cost the Pawnee, and they got ripped off big time using merchants in Genoa. And at that time, Genoa wasn't sure whether they wanted Indians in town or not. The same thing happened in Dannebrog when the Pawnee retook that land, and the people in Dannebrog said, what can we expect when the Pawnee are in town? I said, well, you can expect a lot of people who are better dressed and better educated than usually you see in this town. And that's exactly what's happened. Well, at any rate, then Mick and I were commissioned with the job of building the second vault. And Mick and I did that, and were included. Louis was a pallbearer, and I got to know Louis a lot better, and he insulted me about every hour on the hour, I would say. He told me shoveling sand to cover the remains, and he said, it's still a line in my family, Louis. It's a tradition now in a German family. He says, don't try to keep up with me, Raj. Just set a pace you're comfortable with and stick with it. So.
And he did. He did.
He did.
But I worked harder when the red light came on the camera, right, Louis?
He can be sound asleep snoring, and that light turns green. And how he figures that out, he snaps right out there. Gets going. He's bionic.
Yeah. Chuck, what were factors do you think that contributed to the non-Indian population of Nebraska becoming supportive of the Pawnee position?
I think a part of it was what people like Roger had done with, in his newspaper columns and political cartoons, and a lot of it, I think, was the way that the Pawnee handled it, and a lot of it was brought on by just the way the Historical Society handled it, which was very poorly. And I was at one meeting. I belonged to an organization in Omaha called the Westerners. A bunch of people who are interested in the West and have a monthly meeting, which some author will talk to them about something Western. And I remember Jim Hansen coming up to make a pitch to get the Westerners to pass a resolution supporting or opposing the legislation. And I was at that meeting, so I stood up after he made his pitch and made mine too about what the issue really was. And they had no trouble voting it down, just saying, well, we don't think that we belong in that fight. And so they withheld their support. And I got to meet Roger at that time too. He was, by then I was president of the Historical Society, and Roger was still beating up on us pretty badly. And by that time we pretty well shaped up. And so I asked Roger to please be kind to us.
That was one of the most startling developments in this whole thing, because the Historical Society is a central institution in my life. It's been the foundation of my writing, my research. I've been a life member since I think '62. It's really an important organization to me, and I cared about it. And I saw a lot of things going on that were really bad, and then this whole repatriation thing blew it up. And I saw this institution dear to me disappear. It was no longer a part of my life, and in fact, it was the exact opposite. So that was the end of it. A lot of my students were working there. They'd graduated with degrees in folklore and history and so forth. They were at the Historical Society. And one of them, John Carter, came up to me and he said, "Raj, you're never going to believe what's happened." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "We have a new member of the board of directors, and he's an Indian. More than that, he's an Oglala," And oh no, this isn't going to work, because I figured it was going to take generations for this whole thing to heal. The next thing I knew, the Pawnee were up here doing an honoring dance for Chuck and the director of the Historical Society, and I sat there with my jaw open because I couldn't believe that Chuck in particular, but the state of Nebraska in general, had healed over this incredible wound. And suddenly the Historical Society truly was back on the right track. And some of the people who had been in the society staff and who took a lot of pounding, Dave Murphy, Rob Bozell, they'd been with us all along and took a hell of a pounding for having done that. And now it was their philosophy and their point of view, in the very gentle point of view, not a domineering or victorious sort of a way, but now we began to get the feeling we'd won.
One other thing, Rob Bozell, I remember him, during these things with all the tension and everything else, he had this program for Pawnee youth, and he was teaching them archaeology.
Yep.
But it was the other, and it wasn't trying to justify the digging up and possession of bones or human remains. It was, what the studies are, if you want to get into that, and but he kind of put a gentleness on it, and he's carried through. His dedication has really impressed me over all these years, you know, that he's still doing it, and I really appreciated that.
One thing that I noticed was that the Historical Society, they treated those bones like a fetish. They had an emotional attachment to them, but they couldn't deal with the live walking and talking Pawnee. And we saw that. We decided to take the high road. We wouldn't say anything bad about the Historical Society because we found out it was like Richard Nixon time. We got a phone call from an employee of the Historical Society. He wanted to talk to us. And we met him in the zoo bar. And he talked to us, and he told us that a lot of the employees at the Historical Society were in favor of the Indian point of view, but they were afraid to say anything. So we changed our whole strategy by taking the high road, so we could deal with that problem. And we didn't know what to call him, our own little deep throat. So we called him Paleo Man, Paleo for short. And in the end, when they had the first reburial, the Pawnees selected Paleo as a pallbearer. And he came, and you should have seen the faces of the Historical Society when they saw Paleo. They wanted to know what was he doing there. But he was coming from the heart, and he was our friend and Pawnee's friend for life.
And who's Paleo?
I don't know if I can tell his name.
Okay. We can just leave it up to people to figure it out somehow, maybe. Like Deep Throat's identity wasn't known for years, so maybe Paleo's identity will be known sometime.
Yeah, Richard won't mind.
Okay, yeah. In what ways, Chuck, do you think that the movement here in Nebraska changed white Nebraska?
That experience?
Yes.
Well, it changed two things, I think. First of all, you know, working to secure the trust of the tribes, and you know, we saw the Omahas when the sacred pole was returned from back east. I think it was Harvard, to the tribe. They asked the Historical Society to basically, to keep it, to take care of it, and you know, make it available to them when they wanted it for ceremonies. And that agreement was reached. I think another important thing was what Judy had done with the between the commission and the Historical Society, to where now it's routine for them when they discover any remains that Judy is one of the first ones notified, so they can get together and talk about the transfer and you know, whatever. The tribes also asked that the Historical Society take the burial goods and the funerary goods of patrimony and keep them, and you know, until they're disposed, you know, to the various tribes for reburial. non-Indians, I think you're seeing an understanding, and more recently, I think the fact that the white clay fight, let's say, over the liquor license out there, had a great deal of non-Indian support, shutting them down. And I think that if politicians took note of that it wasn't, to continue ignoring the Oglala Sioux tribe, although the Oglala Sioux tribe isn't, we own Nebraska, our western part of it anyway, from what the Pawnees didn't. And, respect for them. But there's a number of things. I think that the fight really caused some respect for Indians, that they did stand up, and that the religions are still alive, the traditions are still alive.
Okay. Roger, what do you think the lessons from this whole repatriation struggle are?
Wow. I know what it's meant to me and my family, but I think the broader level, I really do think things have changed in Nebraska. The question before, when the Pawnee began to return to Nebraska, was why would the Pawnee want to come to Nebraska? Because this was all Pawnee land, and that awareness, as Chuck says, has now become much wider. The idea that there was history before the railroad, before Lewis and Clark, is now pretty much in their face. I mean, it can't be avoided. To me, personally, the return of the Pawnee to Pawnee land has been an enormous thing. It's the biggest thing in my life, and it's a wonderful thing to see. Because now we find that we have the Pawnee Arts Center in Dannebrog. We find that the people who are most interested in the books, for example, about the Pawnee, while there's a huge interest in non-Indian peoples about the Indian people of Nebraska, we find the Pawnee are as interested, because now, after 140 years, they have to relearn and remember too. And that has been, for me, a really beautiful thing to see, a people regaining its heritage. I'm a folklorist by training. I'm a folklorist by love. And to see tradition being restored and renewed and embraced again, as with the Corn Project, with the cultural projects, the people now inventorying the land that the Pawnee own in Nebraska, to remember how those plants were used, and to find out who still remembers how those plants were used. I see folklore alive again, being regenerated, not simply just being hang on to continue and gradually fade out, like the tall tale, which I was once interested in. Now we see it fading out because the tall tale no longer has currency in mainstream culture. But to see something like Pawnee culture reborn is really pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's great. And I have heroes from this repatriation struggle, and you three are amongst those groups. But Louis, who do you think was probably the most influential person in this whole ordeal?
There were so many people involved. I can't pinpoint one. But it was good to have a director like the Historical Society had, because it all bound the rest of us together in opposing him and his colleagues. But I remember the day I was testifying, Senator Higgins said to me, "Mr. LaRose, I wouldn't want my grandmother's remains put on a shelf for display. She ought to be treated with respect." your ancestors ought to be treated with respect too. We should treat each other the same. And when I saw that light going on, I realized that the majority of Nebraska people would think the same thing. Treat our ancestors with respect, white or Indian. And it was a good day for me to hear the testimony of Senator Higgins.
Yeah, this whole law could have never occurred without a lot of people involved. So there are a lot of heroes in this whole process. Chuck, like to ask you another question, and that's what remains to be undone? What remains to be done in Nebraska in terms of protection of culture, protection of human rights, and even sovereignty?
I think what's happening, and I got to give credit to the Indian Commission and to Judy Gashkibas for putting before Nebraska, the Standing Bear and various other tribal leaders and the importance of Indians and Indian culture. And it used to be a terrible thing, I imagine, to hear drums beating in the Capitol, and anymore, it's not an uncommon thing at all, to have a celebration of the Indian veterans or various other things. So I think things like that. I think Roger Welch, needs to be recognized too for a couple of things, for what he has done with the big audience that he has as a folklorist, as a humorist, and educating people, and also for bringing the tribe back into Nebraska, bringing the Pawnee tribe by turning his land over to the Pawnee, and to give them a presence again in Nebraska, to where other farmers and ranchers presumably have also offered some of their lands to return to the Pawnees. I think just keeping up with that, and Louis LaRose himself deserves an awful lot of respect, and he would be up there among the central people I would put. And you ask about the important people, and certainly he was. He's a real fighter. I've known him for many years with the National Congress of American Indians, and but that's basically it, the way I see it.
Jim, one of the kind of a personal crusade of mine that happened by accident when the Pawnee were first looking for a place to rebury the remains. A group came up to visit us, and it was really the first contact I'd ever had with the Pawnee, other than in the struggles with the Historical Society, where we were on the same side. I got to know like Monkey Echo Hawk, but there wasn't really a personal kind of contact. It was in this not business context, but the struggle. A committee came up, and Linda, and my wife, and I invited them to look at our place as a potential site for reburial. And things happened during that visit that shook us to our roots. And that night, after they left, they decided not to bury on our place because they were offered land at Genoa, which was right on the village site, and that worked out better at that point. But Linda and I sat down that night, and we had exactly the same thought, and it was one of those things where we were trying to decide who was going to say the idea first. And it was that that day we realized that the Pawnee were not the visitors on our land, but we were the visitors on their land. Later on, we found out that that was indeed true, because when the Danes crossed the river right there at that place, there were 300 Pawnee camped right there on that place, late April 1871. And we decided that we were going to leave that land and our home to the Pawnee in our will, which is already a big thing for a white guy whose idea is acquisition, accumulate, give it to your kids. That's what you're supposed to do. But we decided to do that. Then when Bunky called up and Mr. Howell, and they said that they needed a place to rebury because the ground at Genoa was already filled and they needed more burial space. And they asked if they could look again at our place. We drove around. I showed them several places where I thought a suitable place would be for a reburial. If they were certainly welcome to use that land as far as I was concerned. And when we reached the final place where the reburial was determined to happen, Bunky stepped out of the car and he said, "I just changed my mind about where I want to be buried," and that sealed it. Well, we had a meeting, a long meeting, hours, with lawyers and representatives of the Pawnee Nation, Linda and I, about how we were going to handle this. Do we sell an acre of land to the Pawnee, rent them some land? They're going to loan it anyway, so what did it matter? Just get some sort of variance for them to rebury. My position at that point, because I was still nursing the anger that I'd had before, was let's just bury the remains, and to hell with anybody else. I mean, just do whatever you feel we need to do. Linda was the one who came up with a solution that was really the craziest idea that anybody's ever had. She said, "Let's give it to him now, so that we can be here when we're alive, instead of all the good things happening when we're dead." So we did, and that has been an earth-shaking thing for us. Huge beyond belief. It's amazing what happens when you give away what you own. It's a lesson that we probably all could have learned a long time ago, I think, especially from the native tribes, which I had already learned from the Omaha and the Winnebago and the Lakota, but now I got to experience it myself. So what I guess I'm leading up to is, one of the things we need to do in the future is to throw this insane idea out to the other people. Because people hear that, and it's not that they're against returning land to the rightful owners. They've never thought of it. It's never occurred to them. If someone stole my truck out here right now, and the police stopped them, they'd return it to me. And even if he sold it to somebody else, I'd get my truck back. Well, it seems to me that's the way it is with this land, too. More and more people who have families like mine. My son is in Paris. My daughter is here in Lincoln. I've got a daughter in Minneapolis. They're not coming back to Dannebrog, Nebraska, to Pawnee land. So in our case, it wasn't that hard, because they weren't coming back to live in this little bitty town in the middle of Nebraska. Other people came up to us and said, "My children are all stinking rich. They don't need the place I own. We think the Pawnee would be interested in this." I said, "If they're not, I am. It's a beautiful place." Mr. Reed gave us his land, a business building in Dannebrog, more farmland south of Aurora, because people had never thought of this before. What I'm trying to do now is to let more and more people know, why let the state or the government take your land when you die? Why let children giving children wealth is the worst thing you can do. We can see that in national politics. I think what happens when you give children wealth. It's a bad idea. Why not give it back to the rightful owners? I would like to see more and more people across Nebraska return land to tribal ownership. Thus ended the lesson.
A question, when many Pawnees go to your land, the first thing they want to do, that's Pawnee land, but the first thing they want to do is go to the Loup River. Why do you think that is?
Because that river is sacred. It's like the Jordan River in the Holy Land. That was what happened. The first contingent that I almost don't like to talk about on camera because I fall apart. Your brothers and sisters who were in that group walked into the river with their clothes on, pulled the water over their hair, asked Linda for jars so they could take some of that water from that river home. I've never looked at that river again in the same way. The Loop River, plenty potatoes, is what it's called because it was so bountiful. It was the giver of all the food they ever needed. One told me it's like camping in the middle of a Hy-Vee grocery store when you were down there living on the river. The river is sacred, and now it's sacred to us too. The land that was beloved to me now is sacred too, because now the elders have returned to rest there forever in a Pawnee land. That was Bunky's point. He said, we don't want to put the elders back into white man's land, even if it's you, Roger. I said, I understand that. They need to be reburied in Pawnee land, and now they are.
Louis, what do you think the future holds for Indian people here in Nebraska?
I think there's high hope. We're getting stronger. We're doing a lot of things on our own. We're developing political strength. It's a good day to be a Nebraskan, because we're immigrants to Nebraska. When the Bagels are, we were forced out of Wisconsin. But we're happy immigrants.
And Chuck, is there anything you would like to say about this, about the conversation we've been holding today?
I attended one of the burials on Roger's place, and I was extremely impressed with it. And who was it Pat? No. Who said the prayers?
Pat Leading Fox was there.
Yes. And when he prayed, there was a pan of embers, and the cedar was put on that too. And I remember of it, the cedar flowing down into the grave site and then up into the sky. And that just really impressed me, that it's always said that you're freeing those spirits, when you turn them back to earth. And that was kind of the rallying cry, of the battle. And when I saw that, it just seemed like it was happening, But and another thing too was the return of the crania from back east somewhere, and it was you wrote about it wonderfully, about the 6 or 7, was it? 6 scouts that were just got out of the U.S. military back in the 1800s, and were on their way to Oklahoma to meet up with their people, and some village people in Kansas killed them. And their crania were sent for study back east somewhere. But when they returned from, I think it went through Fort Riley, Kansas, was it? Mm-hmm. And a contingent of honor guards accompanied the remains to be returned to the Pawnees, and they had it. It was beautifully done, I think. Giving a flag for each one of them symbolically for having served in the U.S. military. But things like that have happened, and I think that they're beautiful examples of what could happen when people do the good thing, when they do the right thing.
Louis, is there anything else you'd like to say before we conclude?
Well, what I'm going to say is emotionally hard for me to talk about. Among the Pawnees that would come up was an elderly gentleman who survived the Bataan death march
Alex
in World War
Matthews.
II.
Alex Matthews.
And when he was treated that way, I can't describe the amount of pain and despair I felt. When we took the remains from the Historical Society, we were going out of town, caravan. And when we went past one street, there was uniformed officers standing and saluting. I can't talk. But that soldier in the Pawnees finally got a gesture of respect in a traditional way.
That was a powerful moment. I've heard about that as well. I've heard others mention that.
Paraguay was crying, and so was I.
Roger, is there anything else you'd like to say in conclusion?
The symbol of Dannebrog, that's the name of the Danish flag, very Danish town. Everything in town is Danish, except invading Germans like me, is a heart painted with checkers on one side and Zoll on the other. It's just a well-known Danish symbol because the town is Danish. They recently repainted it, and they painted two eagle feathers hanging from it because the town is now Danish. It's now Pawnee too. And I think that's really what's happening in Nebraska. I'm with Louis on this. I'm very optimistic. Not only are the Pawnee back, but the understanding that there were people here before is also here, and that the people here are going to be here in the future. The tribes are not simply a matter of the past, they're a matter of Nebraska's future.
From the Pawnee Nation, I thank all of you for your contributions to what you've done in terms of us being able to get our ancestors back and putting them back in Mother Earth here in the homeland. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
The board of directors.